Welcome to this episode of Tribal Fires, and it's brought to you through the Dumbartung Aboriginal Corporation. And today we're going to talk about an experience that I had way back in 1988, and it was about a invitation, if you like, a trip to Brazil to represent our people at an international conference. And Selena will read this letter from the organisers that summed up our representation at that conference.
This is just a short letter to say thank you for your very active participation in our Congress in Rio. I do hope that you felt that the event was a success. The paper you presented brought a uniquely different view to the conference regarding the history and challenges of Australia's Indigenous peoples. The lived experience of the descriptive of the presentation of your paper indicated an insightful perspective on the human rights and racism that Australian Aboriginal people face, and especially the related and relevant stories that your grandmother spoke to you about this, that so fittingly was adopted into the presentation. For this we thank you. It is important for us to get relatively fast feedback on an Indigenous person's perspective. The planning for the Hamburg Congress is well underway, and it is likely that the program will largely be decided at a forthcoming meeting towards the end of November. It is, I think, very necessary to maintain the momentum of Indigenous persons' involvement in our congresses. Please consult with other Indigenous people as you feel appropriate. Thank you for coming to Rio and for bringing the closing ceremony to a memorable end with the Didgeridoo. Yours sincerely, Margaret A. Lynch.
So in 1988, it was a special time for me. I was approached by the Secretariat of the National Aboriginal and Islander Child Health Agencies. They represented, childcare right across Australia, and I was asked to present a paper internationally in Rio De Janeiro in Brazil. And I was only 30 years old, so, for me it was an incredible request, and I felt somewhat proud, and I felt excited about going to Rio de Janeiro and representing Aboriginal people and our people right across Australia. So, I prepared the paper, and I remember talking to my old grandmother, who spoke to me about, when she gave birth to my mother, she was unable to get into any of the regional hospitals in the southwest, so my mother was born in a chook pen, and that, along with a number of other stories that my grandmother told me all those years ago, I put into the paper and presented in Rio de Janeiro, and it represented the oppression and the racism in which Aboriginal people faced, particularly during those years. So off I went to Brazil, and looking forward to seeing a whole different part of the world. And I had my suitcases, and I had my didgeridoo, which was really important for me to take, and I took that with some other cultural material as well, a bit of ochre and boomerangs. I remember feeling much more confident travelling with cultural objects of our people. And anyway, I arrived in Rio de Janeiro, and it was a complete different experience than I could even imagine. It was at that time non-English speaking country, so there was all just broken English at the best when you communicating with people. So I was imagining the conference and where it would be, and so I had a lot of things going on in my head at the time. And anyway, I got to the airport on arrival and went to where the baggage claim area was. So everybody everybody, all the passengers were there waiting to collect their bags, and after a while I spotted my first bag, took that off the rail, and then I took the second bag off. And because of security reasons, I had to actually give the didgeridoo over to the customs in Australia, and they actually put it under with the rest of the luggage. So I was waiting for the didgeridoo to come around so I could collect that for and that was the last piece of luggage I had to get. So as I waited, and I saw all the other passengers collecting their bags, and all of a sudden I was the last person standing there, and it grew silent and somewhat a little bit eerie because everybody had gone, and I was waiting for this object to come through, and it didn't. And I knew that I had to then leave that area because I was starting just to feel uncomfortable. So I went to the customs and the immigration office desk area, and I tried my best to explain to the customs officer that, one piece of my luggage didn't come through, and it was a object that was made of wood. It was a hollow, branch, or big branch of a tree, and on the didgeridoo was painted this snake and goanna, and I'm getting looked at like quite strangely at first, and then that strangeness turned to a little bit of agitation, and I started to realise that he had no idea whatsoever at what I was talking about. But I kept trying to explain, and I said, well, look, it's this long piece of wood that you blow into, and you make these pretty incredible sounds, and it's got paintings that again are snakes, goannas, and all this cross hatching on it, and beeswax on the mouthpiece. And the more I try to explain what the object was, the more bizarre I could see it becoming to them. And then I started to realise that it was getting to a point of where they were getting quite disturbed. So I got in my mind thinking that I either walk away now and this didgeridoo will be lost to me forever. And it was a special didgeridoo given to me by a very, very special person, an old man that I knew from One Arm Point. And or I could persist and try to get them to at least have a look in where the didgeridoo may have landed somewhere, wherever it was. Had to be somewhere, just couldn't disappear. But I started then to realise, it was time to get out of there. And then I sort of heard this voice to my left, and it was a man standing there, and he said, "You're from Australia, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah." I said, he said, "You've lost a piece of baggage." I said, "Yeah, I'm trying to explain." He said, "Yeah." He said, "I can hear what you're saying." He said, "And look, any moment these customs agents are going to intervene, and they're going to think that either one thing you're on maybe drugs, or you're not of sound mind, because they haven't got an idea of what you're trying to explain to them." And he said, "Well, look, I talk Spanish," and he said, and Portuguese. He said, "So look, let me explain to them what it is that you're asking for them to find." And then he started to talk in Portuguese language, I think it was. And I saw the customs agent straight after he spoke to him walk just a number of feet over from the counter, unlock a metal cabinet, and out of the cabinet I saw the didgeridoo come, and I thought, wow, that's incredible. There it is. I thought I was surely not going to see that again. And he said, "Well, look, can you do something for me?" And I said, "Yeah." I saw him getting off just the mobile phone he had at the time, whilst the custom agents were passing over the object, and I actually signed for it. And he said, look, I've just spoken to a man who wants to meet you, he said, because he's also originally from Australia. And he said his name's Ronald Biggs. It was an incredible experience in meeting Ronald Biggs. He was one of the known great train robbers in London. He, robbed a mail train, which, along with another number of men, stole, equated these days to 74 million American dollars. So, he was sent to jail. I think he had a 38-year jail period from the courts in London. And he escaped 3 years later and, landed in Brazil. And Brazil had no policy or agreements with England in terms of extraditing prisoners back from Brazil to England. So, he had spent the next 37 years in Brazil as a man who could, come and go. There were some restrictions placed on him. But, he's a celebrity criminal. He is a little bit like Ned Kelly in the sense of how people may view him or see him. He could be some people's worst enemy, but he's certainly a lot of people's greatest hero as well. He beat the establishment. And by beating the establishment, some people would put that in high esteem. So Ronald Biggs, was certainly treated myself with a lot of respect, and he was very much also wanting to know about our people and Aboriginal people. So, meeting Ronald Biggs was certainly an unforgettable experience in my life. The conference was an incredible experience as well. I met, many, many people from, around different parts of the world, the conference, and, the issues that were spoken about were extremely mainstream and were in the Western world concepts about how they dealt with child trauma and child sexual abuse and infant mortality. But coming from an Indigenous perspective and presenting our stories the way in which we did, it opened the eyes to a lot of people regarding what Aboriginal people were going through in our country. And then I was asked to actually at the end to close the ceremonies by playing the didgeridoo for a whole complete audience of the conference. So there would have been probably over 3,000 or 4,000 people at the conference. And I played the didgeridoo, and, in thinking back in those years in 1988, the didgeridoo was very, very scarcely heard overseas and by non-Aboriginal people. Even here in Australia, it was just starting to, I suppose, become familiar in terms of what, represented our culture. In this year, 2022, of course, the didgeridoo's nearly become like an Australiana icon in terms of what represents the country. But back then, it was rarely heard. And I remember at the end of the closing of the conference, a woman came up to me, and she was involved with music in America, in Philadelphia. And she was telling me that she teaches music. She's the head of a symposium of music. It's sort of like an academy. And she said, look, Mr. Eggington, I could teach many different instruments. She said, I specialise in piano. I remember her saying, in the clarinet. She said, but look, in all the years that I've heard all these different instruments, she said, particularly around the world in different sorts of countries, she said, but I've never, ever, ever in my life heard what I heard today. It was the most ancient, it was the most haunting but mesmerising sound I've ever heard. She said, can I have a look at the instrument? I said, well, it's more an object than it is an instrument. So she had a look, and she's looking down deep inside the hollow branch and timber, and she said, well, where's the mechanism? And I said, well, it doesn't have any mechanisms. All the sounds and what you hear actually come from the body. And she was amazed. She actually said, yep, she had never heard an instrument so, again, so ancient and so earthy. And she gave me some special thanks for giving her the privilege of hearing it for the first time in her life. So, my time in Brazil was, it was a real experience. The conference was, special, as I said, for me to represent Aboriginal Australia at such an early age, just 30, and, talking about such an important issue and, relating that also to hearing from, delegates from other countries talk about, issues dealing with infant mortality and child abuse. But, the real experiences that I got from that travels, and what I found was, just walking the streets in a place like Brazil. And at that time, there was a massive issue with street kids and how the governments were dealing with the street kids in terms of the brutality, torture. And there were a number of street kids that were reported in the media that had, literally gone missing. And some of the authorities were, being questioned about how these kids were going missing because, they had a tremendous impact on things like tourism and the safety and well-being of just the general population. So, these were all homeless children. And when I started to look, as I walked the streets in Brazil, at certain issues like homelessness, it started to make me think that, here in Australia, of course, there's a massive homeless problem. And, but back in that period and that era, a lot of the homelessness in Australia was due to, mainly men who had just been released from different institutions and orphanages, and, you had alcoholism as a major issue of homelessness in cities like Sydney. I remember where I grew up in Sydney, I would work near Hyde Park and places in Darlinghurst where a lot of the homeless, men particularly were. But in Brazil, you actually saw, whole families, and it was the first time that I saw, where you'd have a mother and a father, obviously, and then you had all these cardboard boxes, and I would see these kids sort of being bedded down at dusk, if you like, as I walked, into, cardboard boxes that were acting as, a place for them to sleep. And I remember seeing, and it was wretched, it was these huge big sorts of tops of that opened up into the sewerage systems, and people were literally crawling down to the sewer systems in order to, to be able to sleep safely on the streets. When I returned back to Perth, back home, I reported to the body that, asked me to represent Australia at the conference, and, spoke to them about the conference and the reception that we got in reference to, the issues with the didgeridoo as well as the paper. And I did a number of interviews on different radio stations about, the experience in Brazil. And I was asked by a number of people, because I read the paper out over the ABC radio, and there were a number of people who, wanted to access the paper. And, I freely gave of that knowledge and that information, because it's really important that as many people as is possible can get to hear and understand as what's happened to our people in terms of dispossession and impoverishment in this country. And, again, it's an experience that I'll never forget. It was the first of what was to become many international and national presentations. And it was the presentation that gave me, I think, the confidence and gave me the will to, to keep going in terms of my work in the Aboriginal community, because I knew that a lot of the stories and the history and the tragic circumstances that our people were caught in and were having to survive in here were equated to be very similar to what I had seen in South America, and of course the poverty and the impoverishment in places like Brazil and certain parts of Asia, but particularly in Africa, is world known. And the impoverishment, I believe, and the sorts of issues in which Aboriginal people were challenged with was kept a hidden history in relationship to Australia, and was very much the world was blinded to and didn't see clearly what was happening with our people. So I saw then the need to continue my work. And when I look back on Rio de Janeiro, and I look back on Brazil, I suppose that's the one great thing that I can be blessed for in the sense of my memories, is it gave me the strength to continue. And I remember during my time there, in those areas in which those that suffered the most were the ones that gave so much as well. I remember I spoke to a lot of the mobs that were just living with very little, but they were happy, and they were, they weren't intoxicated, nor were they vague in the sense of drugs or escaping the poverty, but they were actually existing, surviving, and in some ways thriving. And it also then started to put into perspective for me that as per se in the Western world, is that it's not just money and the security of money that can make somebody happy, and Brazil taught me that.